Well, welcome everyone. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. I am so happy to welcome you to our ACGSV M&A Circle event titled IT Risks Post-Pandemic. A huge thank you to our sponsors, Reed Smith and RSM, for organizing today's event and being a sponsor of ACG Silicon Valley. As many of you already know, ACGSV is the leading business-to-business networking organization in Silicon Valley, providing connections, thought leadership, and enabling personal and organizational growth. We offer an array of networking opportunities with almost 14,000 members in 59 chapters across the world. ACG provides local connections with a global reach. Now, we're offering a variety of virtual events in the coming months, including an event on data in the supply chain tomorrow, an event on networking for today and tomorrow that you don't want to miss. That is on Thursday. And we also have a discussion on ESG next week, and then a few more. So make sure to visit our website, acgsv.org, to see the full calendar of upcoming events. Now, we're excited to get started with our discussion, and I'd like to introduce you to our speakers, Toby Zimmerer from RSM and Gary Stegmeyer from Reed Smith. Toby is a director of cybersecurity due diligence in the transaction advisory service practice of RSM US. He has over 22 years of professional experience developing information security strategies, designing information security programs, developing information security solutions, and lead teams with deploying and operating information security programs. Toby has provided services to domestic and international customers across a breadth of industries, including consumer products, retail, healthcare, life sciences, automotive, high tech, oil and gas, gaming, and telecommunications. So welcome, Toby. Also would like to introduce you to Gary Stegmeyer. Now I'm going to say it the German way. He's a partner in the Reed Smith's Tech and Data Group. He focuses his practice on corporate governance, intellectual property, and internet issues, especially as they relate to privacy, information security, and consumer protection. An experienced and pragmatic litigator, Gary focuses a significant part of his practice on pre-litigation and advisory services relating to business strategy for privacy by design, data protection, intellectual property, and emerging technologies and markets, often acting as outside product counsel to leading innovators and disruptive technology companies. Now, I will hand it over to Toby to get us started and enjoy this discussion.
Awesome, thanks, Yvonne. Jerry, good to see you again. I'll go and lead us off here. It's and looking at what's going on, the news wire is always hot about what's the types of attacks that are taking place to companies that are getting targeted. I'd say just given the breadth and number of attacks we're seeing and the types of companies that are getting targeted. What are some of the regulatory and industry impacts you're seeing that are coming up, and some of the questions that are being raised as part of the due diligence process when a portfolio company is looking to acquire or carve out a target?
Sure. So, I think the first question that can impact a deal immediately is the answer to, have you ever had unauthorized access to or acquisition of personal information or data? And I do the or data as like a parenthetical because I'm a lawyer, that's how we talk, because oftentimes the specialists are focused on personal information because of breach notification, but in a broader context of ransomware and other types of threats, business continuity related activities, access to systems and access to data and the vulnerability of those systems is increasingly front and center, and changing, frankly, how a lot of organizations think about, or at least in my view, should be thinking about diligence in the context of transactions.
That's interesting. I think to build on top of that, as we start to see these types of attacks take place, we have these reviews that are happening as part of the due diligence process. I'd be interested in getting your perspective on what type of role do the senior leaderships that, whether it's within the portfolio company or within a target, plays in terms of dealing with, with taking responsibility for a certain type of, for an attack or for a breach, or for an adverse event that's, whether it's the loss of something that's regulated, or whether it's, more broadly related to things like intellectual property theft.
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty easy sort of foot stomping takeaway, which is when the historic exercise of judgment is questioned, the first thing large organizations do is substitute new judgment. Doesn't matter whether the judgment was good or whether it was bad. When it is questioned, with enough severity, it's substituted. And what that means directly, in other words, these are fall on your sword, out the door kind of events, and everybody knows the drill, especially at a certain level. But where it comes in directly, right? The black letter legal point of this is there's some recent Delaware case law that makes it very clear that what we call the business judgment rule, the thing that protects boards, directors, and officers, will likely get closer scrutiny in the rearview mirror than it would in the front end. So it used to be we would generally say, look, if you did your homework, you're more likely to get a pass. But what we're seeing when it comes to data-focused issues and things that are called mission critical regulatory risks, those are the kinds of things that are going to get more scrutiny. Now, precisely what scrutiny? Hard to tell because these are newer cases. But the critical piece from my perspective is if you haven't done an assessment of what your mission critical risks are and risk rank them and done that evaluation, you're setting yourself up for the questioning of that hindsight exercise of judgment. And that's really something we're seeing more of specifically. The Marriott Starwood incident garnered a lot of news. It's probably one of the most prominent M&A contexts, as well as the Verizon Yahoo deal. And both of those, had to be generous hiccups on the back end for the acquirer, where the exercise of judgment was questioned, where people were looking. And, fortunately for Marriott, in their particular case, one of the things was significant was that the statute of limitations had passed. So Marriott prevailed in the lawsuit over this conduct, but they prevailed vis-a-vis board involvement in due diligence and looking at the transaction on, I'll say a technicality, which is to say that the court didn't look at the substance. It said these claims are time barred. You didn't get them in time, and so you're out of the case. So we don't know where that goes, but I think the critical piece there is to realize that these issues are coming up in real cases, whereas 5 years ago, it was a little bit more of a hypothetical risk. Toby, if you and I were talking and you said, look, we can help people with technical diligence, I would have said to you, yes, but I can't get people to buy your services or to assist with that. And as you and I were talking before this call today, not only is it happening all the time, but we've now progressed to a place where we're getting to how do we have the legal diligence and the technical diligence work synergistically. And I know from my perspective, I'd love to hear your take on the technical side, because one of the things we're seeing on a lot of deals is the lawyers are in their lane and the tech teams with outside support are in another lane, and neither are talking at all in the deal, whether it's buy side or sell side. And so I'm really curious about your perception about how the market has evolved in the last 5 years in terms of appetite for this, and then some thoughts on how we could do it better.
Sure. I think it's interesting that recently we're seeing a greater shift in the market to consider cyber and IT due diligence as part of the transaction. The number of incidents that are getting reported in the press, the amount of profile and profile, reputation damage, and scrutiny that happens against the company when these types of events occur is widespread. You no longer can really able to hide this. If you report an event from an insurance perspective, that gets published. So even if you think your cyber insurance is going to cover you, it's going to get noticed in the news. So we're seeing a lot more interest from the portfolio companies to come forward as part of a due diligence activity and take a good look at what's going on. It's not just how ready are you from a cybersecurity perspective? They're looking at how well can your infrastructure operate? How modern are you in terms of your technology, the solutions you're using, your standards by which you're enacting and building out your programs? There is a greater appetite, primarily from the acquirer side, to really get a good insight on what's going on. And it's because that can have detrimental effects and downstream impacts, not only from a financial perspective, but also from a regulatory and operational perspective, if they find out after the fact something's gone wrong. We could talk about the case of what happened with Yahoo or what happened with Starwood. A lot of that stuff was not discovered in advance and happened after the case, or even happened during the transaction and wasn't detected. So we're seeing a greater uptick in those services being brought in, and it's broad. It's looking not only at the paperwork side and the operational side, but it's also going as far as doing technical testing, looking at the security vulnerabilities that a particular source may have, or going out and checking, are the applications really secured? Are you properly licensed when you're using things like open source? And at the end of the day, the portfolio companies are making sure that they are minimizing the amount of risk they have from a regulatory perspective, from an intellectual property perspective. And there's a greater appetite for them to get on top of that, because they don't want to find out after the fact that their $10 million, $20 million, $50 million investment is now going to cost them another 30%. Plus, they have to deal with the regulatory body who's going to come in and start to do a full-blown audit on them, because the target they acquired has a whole lot of issues that weren't reported or discovered in advance.
It's funny, Toby, that you mentioned that. I often think about two things. One, and the intersection of what we're talking about, is I was talking about a decade ago with a really senior leader at one of the leading underwriters, and they were concerned about security in an IPO transaction, and they got me on. So privacy and data security guy, it's not pretty routine for us to be talking directly to the bankers. Mm-hmm. So this was a, hey, this is an important call because we've been talking about wanting to talk to the bankers. Where does this go? And we got to sort of the net, piece of this. And I said, look, our window as lawyers is limited. I can tell you the documentation looks good. I can tell you the ink doesn't look wet. I can tell you when we interviewed the people, they seem competent, they're proficient, they're using relevant frameworks, but ultimately, I can only tell you what I can see. I haven't actually tested any of the controls. I haven't done that side of the work. So from a legal perspective, I can tell you it looks good, but the most important part of that takeaway really was, but I can only tell you what I could see. I can't tell you what I couldn't see, right? It's like walking around a car and you look at the paint job and you go, rental car, paint looks great. Well, that doesn't tell you whether the brakes are going to work. It doesn't tell you whether there's any gas. And that shift, that was a decade ago. We're really seeing, at least in my experience, changes in that. And one of the things that we're seeing drive changes in that process is the emergence of reps and warranties insurance. And I know you and I wanted to talk a little bit about how that is impacting cybersecurity and data related diligence. And I know you had some thoughts on that, Toby.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, we're seeing a lot of a couple things. One, it's been really interesting to see how savvy both the insurers, the lawyers, even the buyers and the sellers have become in this space. And we're seeing greater pushback, during the reps and warranties discussions regarding the issues that are being uncovered, whether it's antiquated technology, whether it's security vulnerabilities, whether it's readiness of the program, a whole litany of issues. Anything that the R&W process can deem as a potential risk, they're starting to put exclusions in place, and they're starting to take a very conservative approach on what they're going to include under a coverage perspective and under a warranty perspective, where they're calling out very specific exclusions of what's not going to be covered or what points they're going to provide coverage from a date timestamp going forward, and anything that's been deemed to have happened in the past or as a result of a past action, they're tending not to go and cover. And it's making the process a bit more convoluted, a bit more complicated, which is why we're starting to see a lot of these reviews happen in advance, because the organization, the portfolio companies, particularly the buyers, want to get ahead of this and really understand, what is the true risk we have, and the insurers are also trying to minimize their exposure as well. And the number of cyber insurance breaches that have been paid out in large sums has taken a very large toll on the insurance industry, and the insurance providers are taking a stand to say, we want to limit our exposure because we're paying out a lot, and if an organization is deemed to have a number of different exposure points, they're going to push back. They're going to put those exclusions in place. So they're trying to get it so the organization, so anybody who's buying or selling wants to understand, well, what is my risk exposure? Well, how's it going to affect my price? How's it going to affect the insurance we're getting? And they're taking a very conservative approach at this point. You brought up an interesting topic, and I'd be interested in getting your perspective on this. It's as we go through this due diligence process, the perception of risk is it varies. I could be looking at risk from my financial statement perspective. I could be looking at it from a pure compliance perspective. What are some of the things you're seeing in terms of when you go through this due diligence process and you're working with these other teams, whether it's the lawyers, whether it's the accountants or the auditors? What is your take in terms of their understanding of risk, and how do you, I'll say, you bridge that that perception between a very narrow point of view on what risk is per the particular individual's point of view, and how do you bring that to a broader perspective within due diligence?
So I think it's a great question. And I actually think there isn't a consensus. I think there's a consensus among people who view themselves as risk professionals, but I think many folks from an accounting or consulting background or law don't necessarily view themselves first and foremost as risk professionals. Or, there's that old Harvard Business School thing of, don't let people put the monkey on your desk, right? We need problem solvers. And so a lot of what I see in deals frequently on the law side are specialists who know the law cold, but they don't know what reps and warranties insurance is. They are unfamiliar. They're not necessarily litigators. They're unfamiliar with deal structures and remedies. And often they have a real difficulty getting comfortable with, executives who say, look, I deal in risk all day and I make decisions all day on imperfect information. Perfect information doesn't exist. And the CEO would present it this way. Look, okay, you've identified a risk. Well, we identify, we shift, we remediate, we transfer, which is sort of the shift permutation, or ultimately we can accept. And there are basically 4 or 5 tools that we have, depending on which model you're using. But in most decisions, we have a combination of those things. So it's reps and warranties insurance, it's due diligence, it's ultimately a decision that says, hey, is this a deal that we're going to do? I was actually running, tight for this call where I'm working on a deal where the general counsel said, well, we've worked through the issues. If you find a deal that doesn't have any risk, let me know. But in our space, that deal doesn't exist. So if we're not going to do deals that have risk, we're just not going to do any deals. And it was a very sort of shrewd observation. But what I find sometimes on the accounting side is, because of Sarbanes-Oxley and experience with SOX, CEOs will sometimes get into a situation. Let's say, Toby, we're working on a deal, or there was technical diligence on a deal, and they come back and I'll get a phone call from the CFO or COO who says, I need you to talk to the CEO. Again, and it's very sort of rare, not an automatic thing for me as a specialist to get directly engaged. And the CEO will call me 2 minutes later and they'll say, I'm trying to understand. We've been audited by, highly respected, large accounting firm. Our financials have been fine for years, 302 and 404, we're good. But the diligence report is telling me that our security posture isn't good. What's going on here? And we invariably have this moment where we have to explain, where I find myself explaining, that the SOX controls go to things that would impact the integrity of the financial statements, and nothing more. And what we're seeing is an evolution of the accounting firms realize, hey, we might have some exposure here because this communications disconnect. And so when there's a data breach or an incident, especially in the midst of a deal, everyone is digging in, right? And literally everyone is digging in, and there's a whole lot of the nose game, right? Not my job. Everything I told you was true based on what I looked at. And it's uncomfortable. And part of the emergence there is a lot of the folks historically that were doing that 302 and 404 SOX work weren't necessarily from the pure cybersecurity side of those shops. And so people are working a lot more closely. And frankly, they're even then tying into the SEC and disclosure issues and how things come together. And I think one of the things, to give an example of how this plays out in a simple real deal, was I worked on a deal where there was a corporate lawyer on the other side of a very large, very respected law firm, but none of the privacy specialists and security specialists whom I knew were actually working on the deal. And we got to negotiating the reps and warranties, and they said, a bunch of very reasonable arguments. I was on the buy side, and we ultimately said, everything you said is reasonable. That's not how this is going down. We're giving you 300 million reasons for us to get our way. And so the risk allocation for all of the reps and warranties related to cybersecurity ran directly to the seller. And lo and behold, there was a problem, after signing, but before closing. And that was the risk allocation. And it was tied into the amount of diligence. As on the buyer side, I think we had 48 hours to do all of the privacy and cybersecurity diligence, and we had no direct contact with the people inside the company. So that was pretty much, a straight cram down for us. And later I did one of these panels, Toby, and this is why I wanted to share this example, where another panelist was like, see, if good cyber diligence has been done, this would have never been an issue. And I had to say, after the fact, well, it wasn't an issue. It was a press story, but the seller ate all of the financial risk, all of the reputational risk. They got exactly what they wanted in the deal from the buy side, right? Which is to say something did happen, and it wasn't the buyer's responsibility.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting topic here, and it's, as I've been in that same position where you have 48 hours to do your due diligence and get it done, and we're closing the deal on a Friday. When should these types of reviews from a technical and from a security and regulatory perspective outside of financial due diligence take place?
So we talked about this a little bit. One of the things I'm really seeing from an evolutionary perspective is I'm seeing them happen earlier and sooner. And some of that is reps and warranties insurance, but some of that is just the import into that go, no go. And sometimes I call it a gangrene toe situation, right? If I buy this company and I'm buy side and they have issues, do I somehow either contaminate my business directly, or do I indirectly contaminate it by virtue of reputational risk? Use the hospitality example we were talking about earlier, right? If one big brand buys another big brand and it creates a ton of press attention, consumers don't know the difference. We've all been, I know a lot of consultants, and you say, where do they live? And they say X hotel chain, right? That's where they live. And so the reputational implications that run all of that together are causing these things to happen both deeper in terms of depth and breadth and earlier. So if you think of like X, Y, and Z axis, on two of those dimensions, we're getting a lot more coverage generally. But I know that you had some thoughts about this and some things we wanted to sort of tease out for the audience. And I know we're also going to have some interaction, but maybe you can react to that.
Yeah, I think it's the sooner they get ahead of it, the sooner they identify it. To your point, they can, typically we're going to look at seeing, the buyer actually look at trying to get concessions back from the seller. It's had some clawbacks. We're seeing that they're putting larger amounts in escrow just because of the types of risks that the buyers think interprets or believes they're going to take on if they go through the transaction. Gone as far as seeing them go pencils down and say it's not worth it. The risk's way too big. And I think to your point, getting on top of that earlier and incorporating it as part of the process versus trying to get to the last stage where everybody has diligence fatigue and everybody is, pretty tired of going through this process and you're getting partial answers or incomplete data. It has a substantial impact. Again, you can look at the ransoms that were paid out in the last couple of months and the absolute impact that had on a company's ability to deliver goods and services to their clients. We're not talking about the data breach now. We're talking about supply chain issues, and the supply chain challenges are well known. Portfolio companies don't want to take that on. So that getting ahead of that and getting an understanding of that risks earlier. Again, from the buyer side, they're looking to try to get as much concessions back because they're going to take on that risk once that transaction closes and it's signed.
I think, Toby, you really hit the nail on the head, and sort of the takeaway for folks on the call. You've crystallized it for me in this way. And I think about it this way, but you've sort of really crystallized it. If you're on the buy side, you want to figure this out earlier, especially if you're looking for leverage in the deal, right? If it's a competitive situation or it's a non-competitive situation, right? We've all seen those venture deals where guess what? The term sheet for the next round doesn't come until they're on 72 hours of cash left, right? And nobody wants to out negotiate against the other side and the clock. And so if your buy side earlier is better, it creates leverage, helps you manage risk, leads to spear things. Flipping it around on the sell side, no seller, unless you're a cybersecurity company, ever got into business because of cybersecurity, because of privacy. And so as a consequence, when we're thinking strategically from a corp dev perspective, cybersecurity and privacy are issues that a seller invariably wants to keep to the periphery and essentially wants to do the, Star Wars waves the hand, these are not the droids you're looking for, and off the stormtroopers go, right? And I don't like to think of us as outside folks as the stormtroopers, because I like to think, well, we can hit things and we are skilled, but for especially middle market or smaller deals, when the stormtroopers, show up, they absolutely overwhelm the business. And I've seen more than a few companies on the sell side who weren't positive the deal was going to go through and needed to keep running the company while the stormtroopers were crawling all over the place.
Yep. No, I agree. I'd be interested in getting your perspective on this. We're not dealing with, Fortune 500 companies here. Typically, you hit the nail on the head there where it's mid-market. So, when you take a look at these types of impacts these security events have, or these privacy related events have on a mid-market company, I mean, how much bearing does that have in terms of that risk profile? And how much bearing does that have in terms of the types of decisions that a buyer is going to make or a seller is going to make, as they, try to go through with one of these deals? $150,000 deal, $150,000 fine for, a Fortune 500 companies, drop in the bucket. Do it for a $20 million company. That's substantial. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a paradox because there's a lot of pressure to do less diligence. And this is an area where the consequence of less diligence often can lead to orders of magnitude more risk. So the likelihood in that smaller deal, the 20 million, 50 million, $100 million deal, that if something bad happens because the depth and breadth of diligence didn't occur, the enterprise value of the deal, the whole purpose of the deal, is more likely to be wiped out. And, for serial acquirers, they often have that sort of priced in, right? Because they're doing lots of deals. But middle market deals that are more strategic oriented, I think there's a lot of motivation to go deeper than one otherwise might. And when I say deeper than one otherwise might, what I'm really trying to get at is, if you were doing nothing, do something. If you're doing something, do something better. And that sort of ties into, just some simple rules of thumb, right? If you get a civil investigative demand from the Federal Trade Commission, so routine privacy investigation, and you say, what do I forecast that expense for, Jerry? I'm going to tell you $500,000, just the legal fees. That's not reputation. That's not remediation. That's just, they're going to ask us questions and we have to answer those questions. Or, in a similar framework, there's benchmarking data that says data breach, plus or minus $6 million depending on how you do the stats, and the math. But in the other scenarios we were talking about, Toby, right, ransomware, supply chain, some of those things are sort of knockout punches that could be very difficult to recover from. And the companies, if you're a ransomware outfit, you're just looking for the vulnerable. You're not out there going, let's find the biggest companies. You're looking at all of them, and you're looking for those that are most vulnerable. So again, repeat from sort of the top line, which is less diligence equals more risk and vulnerability, and that can be very dangerous.
No, that's you're absolutely right. I mean, being on the other side of this and seeing the amount of technology spread and the growth towards the cloud, the number of complex applications and processes that companies are trying to offload and be able to incorporate and get their businesses running in this modern technology area, brings a lot of that to the forefront. I think part of the paradigm here as well is that if we start looking at some of the older companies we're dealing with, and I'll use air quotes here, relatively old, 15, 20 years, it's been an interesting perspective to see that they're still running on some older stuff. I'm seeing AS400 mainframes. I'm seeing outdated software and outdated platforms. And that I think that the focus on trying to keep the business running, particularly during these last 2 years, have been a bit of a challenge. And we're coming out of that from an economic growth perspective. It's still, companies are still running pretty lean. I think that there's a lot of subject matter expertise that needs to be in place in order to deal with these complexities. Whether we're looking at the changes in regulations and look at the changes in the way that we're doing business. Be interested in getting some thoughts from your point of view of from the due diligence side. How do you see how do you see the specialists staying up on top of what's current? How do you think that the organizations that are making these decisions and trying to bring this expertise on board to vet these risks are trying to stay current with what's going on, as well as how are they handling some of the changes in the regulations and the way that we're doing business?
So a couple things going on there.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of different ways to attack it, but one, there's that old adage, nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM. And I think that there is a tremendous benefit to using outsiders. And I'll use an example, not in an M&A context. The best data breach incident response company I ever worked with, very prominent cloud company, fantastic company. Everyone would know this company. One of their top executives got sacked. They basically kept their outside advisors at arm's length. The internal team missed something. The exercise of judgment was questioned. 48 hours later, CTO resigns. Now, how do you avoid that, internally? Well, remember, if you're the inside person or the inside team running this corp dev function for integration and support and diligence, if you have outside support, you get much different battlefield visibility, for lack of a better phrase, right? If someone has done 100 deals in the last year versus I did one once in the last 10, that's a very different team and shop and approach. Now, sometimes some people say that may jade the risk perspective, right? I've heard labor lawyers say, look, every single company has a wage and hour issue in Silicon Valley. Like, it comes up every single time, and the corporate folks, Craig, my partner, will be like, I haven't done a deal where that hasn't been an issue. It gets flagged every single time. So that could be one way to sort of jade things. But in our area, Toby, my perspective is that proxies emerge where you say, yes, everyone has this problem, or no, everyone doesn't have this problem. It's like a scatter plot. And so the scatter plot, when you're like, okay, back to basics, right? They're not patching, or they don't have a third-party risk program at all, right? They're not using any GRC software. They're not looking at the supply chain. their third-party risk management is we try and buy from reputable cloud vendors, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a strategy, it's a common one, but it's not the best proxy that we would see. And that's one of the areas where I think there's an intersectionality between the more pure technical diligence and the legal side to be able to map those things. And an example I heard from someone in the last week, they said, they came in, they looked at a company and they said, if you just asked me, tell me about everything that they're doing, I would say they're doing 10 out of 10. They're fantastic. They're doing the best I've ever seen. You know, and then it got quiet and they said, well, what else is there? Well, they're only doing 30% of what needs to be done. So they're doing a 0 out of 10 on 70% of their risk exposure. And so from my perspective, the way I think about the diligence process is how do we get to our proxies faster? You know, you see in the hiring stage, oh, this person went to X school, they got Y grades, they got Z test scores, right? Well, are those things real indicators? Probably not, but they are decision-making proxies. And so I think when you're working with outside advisors, you can get some greater breadth of proxy, especially in cybersecurity. You know, a CISO I know at a Fortune 10 company recently said to me, when I come across security folks inside and they've been at one company their whole career, I immediately discount them because they only know one company.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was very prescient. And I was thinking about it, Toby, in the context of our chat, which is to say, well, how do you get that marketplace visibility that allows you to not only spot the risks, but then evaluate their import in the deal?
Yeah, so I'll attack that from two angles. You know, one from the due diligence side, you know, as being an outside vendor, being able to bring that into the due diligence process does bring some weight and bearing to a conversation, you know, particularly when I'm talking with the management team of the portfolio company. It gives them insights on what we're seeing. And I've been in the space 22 years, I've been around a number of different industries, and to be able to share those insights and points of view, not only from the mid-market, but also to bring in that enterprise point of view, it gives them a little bit more comfort in what's being conveyed to them. It helps them understand a bit more of that broader perspective, and it ultimately helps them really shape up their decision-making process. On the same token, when we have that conversation with, you know, with the management team of the target, it gives them comfort in knowing that they're not talking with somebody who's coming in from an auditing perspective. We're in there to really help understand where they at, share those insights, and be able to bring that same type of industry experience to a conversation to help them understand what we're trying to assess and to really get meaningful answers out of them. If you take that from just a pure audit perspective, I go right down something like PCI, or, you know, straight down the checklist of HIPAA, or I don't know, Sarbanes-Oxley. It's checklist stuff, right? But a checklist doesn't mean that you're secure. It doesn't mean you're protected. It doesn't mean you really have management of your risks. So being able to share those insights and talk about what you've seen other organizations do, be able to ask them meaningful questions that help them understand where you're coming from, be able to share those insights, and also be able to help formulate a point of view is really helpful for both the target side and from the buyer side. Lastly, I think from the targets, particularly the companies we're dealing with here, and, you know, these are organizations that are substantially smaller than some of the other places I've worked and other companies I've dealt with. So it's not unusual for me to walk in and say, okay, where's your CISO? Where's your CIO? Where's your privacy officer? And they'll either say, we don't have it, or we outsource it. And I think, to your point, Jerry, being able to leverage a third party to provide those types of services to these smaller organizations does bring a lot to bear. And I think it brings a lot of expertise that they can't quite get. They can't quite afford. I mean, personally, within cyber, the cyber market's incredibly competitive right now. Wages are way up. It's hard to find people and attract them and retain them. So being able to find a managed service provider who can bring you that blended point of view on how they do things and be able to provide that security insight and guidance to a leadership team within a target or within a small organization, it has a lot of bearing on how well they operate. And a lot of the companies I have talked with where they have a solid MS, managed security service provider, or a managed service provider behind them, that's even acting like their virtual CIO, they've actually had a lot better traction and success in terms of being able to say, here's how we can manage risk. And there's been very few where it's like, you're perfect, there's nothing going wrong. But you're able to say they have the capabilities there to get ahead. They have the expertise on hand to help the organization, which you're looking to acquire, actually perform and meet these risk requirements and minimize what they have in their current state. They're also there to help them grow for the future, which is one of the other things we're looking at. We don't take that snapshot point in time to say, okay, if you're looking at today, they're safe. We're looking at 2-3 years down the road. Okay, well, how long are you going to keep this company around? Where do they want to go? How are they going to get there? Can this service provider support them going forward? And that's a critical part of the process as well, so that when the buyer is looking to actually take on this company, does the target actually have the right resources and teaming available to help them grow and be successful?
Yeah, I think the last part you said really resonated with me, Toby, where sometimes we'll say to clients, you don't have to be perfect, but if you have a plan where you're working on it, that's often as important a diligence signal, right? You might not have some controls in place today, but you can show a roadmap where you're going to do that in Q3 or Q4 the next year. Then from that negotiation standpoint, a buyer can quibble, with you don't have the control, but you have a plan, you're going to be executing against it. And then it's just arguing about the calendar, which is much different.
Totally agree. It's a last couple of due diligence exercises I've been involved with. It's really been focused on that forward-facing view and being able to say, can this service provider help you scale and support where you're going? And is your roadmap, can you achieve the roadmap with what you have? And that becomes a big part of the discussion. So I see we're at, we've got 15 minutes left in the conversation. So I think, Yvonne, Julie, and the ACG team, I know Jerry and I have been having a, back and forth conversation here for a while. What questions are out there?
I think we'll give it to the audience. Anybody have any questions, either addressed to Toby or Gary or both? And you can just unmute yourself and ask the question directly. Or Toby and Gary have just given such a great talk that nobody has any questions. I don't know, do you have anything to go on with, Toby? And as questions come in, we can take some. We don't have to stretch this.
No, I'm thinking through some of the things that we've been talking about here. Jerry, I'd be interested in getting your thoughts on this. Because we talked about supply chain. We know supply chain is a massive issue right now. And during some of the conversations you're having and in the reviews you're conducting, how much importance does that business continuity and that operational recovery capability of a company come into play during the discussions you're having from the due diligence process?
So it's we agreed, and for the folks that are on, Toby and I agreed on the front end we weren't going to talk about COVID as this being a COVID program, but pardon me, but surprisingly, something that we have seen, and I've seen a number of deals recently, was disaster recovery and business continuity has come up, and companies transition quickly and function fine during COVID. But what they hadn't done at all was revise and update and revamp and rework their business continuity and disaster recovery plans. So they had a live fire drill for the last 2 years where they actually went fully remote, operated fully remote. But when you pull these plans off of the shelf today, in many instances, they didn't really use the plans per se. They were more disaster recovery theater. And from my perspective, it was really a reminder that you don't hit a fastball by reading a book, which is to say, the plans are proxies and indicators of readiness, but whether or not you can execute, they're not they're not going to tell you that much. So the good news is many organizations adapted very, very well. I think retail is a good example of a sector, right? Businesses that had some e-commerce capability or takeout and delivery in restaurants or hospitality, some of those businesses pivoted much more quickly. And the ones that had a tough time didn't already have the toehold. Companies that supported remote work on some level had a much easier time. And now we're just moving into a different space or place. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Toby, but it was a great one.
No, I think you have. I mean, I think that you've hit the point of, these organizations need to be able to pivot and continue operating. Yeah, and I think the challenges we're seeing from the supply chain side is, it's less of, okay, it's a COVID issue. We just don't have the people available right now. They've been able to either shift their focus or shift out of the industry, and whether you're looking at the movement of goods from lack of drivers, or whether you're looking at just people changing careers because they wanted to do something different. There's just been a drastic downshift in the availability of resources to execute it, and companies have been struggling to make sure they can get their systems up and running. And thankfully, with the remote workforce, they're able to actually be able to pivot and not to worry about being in the building. But at the same time, they're still looking at how robust are their systems on the back end in order to be able to deal with a failover. And if we look at a ransomware attack, okay, can I get that system completely air gapped, shut down, brought back up on online, and guarantee that backup works? That is becoming a big focus for what we're seeing from the operational side, because typically these attackers sit on the inside for a long time, get in, infect your backups, infect your images, and then they take you hostage. So if you have that process in place, you're able to recover more quickly. The due diligence process is really starting to take a big dive into that. I did see a question come across, and I'm definitely interested in getting your perspective on this, and I'll start with it first. Have I ever seen a deal get shut down because of a cyber incident? In my experience, no. Now, I will caveat that by saying I just got done going through a very extensive review on a company who had a couple of incidents, same type, and had multiple exposures. That reps and warranty conversation got really interesting. We were talking about what's the point of exclusions, what are they going to cover from going forward. I spent a lot of time talking with the insurers and the management team on, was the corrective action plan reasonable? So in my experience, it hasn't shut one down, but I can tell you I'm probably involved in like 3 or 4 right now where we are in very extensive conversations around the reps and warranty side on, are they doing enough? Have they resolved the issues? Can they make sure this does not happen again? Jerry, interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, so 5 years ago, we talked about it, had never seen it happen, saw it happen. And I've seen it happen a number of times, but I think we have to define, what we mean by cybersecurity, right? Because we have privacy due diligence, we've got security related diligence, and we have data related diligence. And the deals that I've seen stop or have buyers walk away from have tended to be focused on data rights. Do you have the rights to do what you do or purport to do? And I have, been at 2 law firms where we basically restructured the department to ensure that the specialists working on the data rights issues are, experts. And what that meant is deeper dives. In some instances, I've heard, 55% of an average M&A deal legal bill being, tech transactions diligence, rolling in sort of the data component. But we've seen deals on data rights stop where this is sort of to your riff on your point, Toby, to the go forward point. This business isn't what we thought it was because of questions about the provenance of data within the business and the ability to take and get and use that data, on a go forward basis. It's not specifically relevant to this context, but I think it's an easy audience example. You might have seen in the last week, Meta, Facebook, announced that they're going to delete all of their face maps or facial recognition, images as part of a serious, business change at least with respect to those images. Well, that's the kind of asset, if you wanted to do AI research and bring good things to light on that data set, that if you weren't able to do that, for example, because somehow the data was collected in a way that didn't comply with the Illinois biometric law or federal law, where that creates a go no go situation. But outside of data rights, when we go to straight cybersecurity issues, I haven't seen a deal stop for that. And frankly, I don't think that I would see a deal stop for cybersecurity per se. And here is why. We talked about that risk management model, right? Identify, accept, shift, et cetera, those remediate. And all of those tools are typically readily available if you can identify it, right? So don't get me wrong. I think there are plenty of deals where there's buyer's remorse because something failed on the identification side, or it wasn't shifted, or it's maybe too late or difficult to remediate. But for the most part, my view is that in cybersecurity, all of the tools we have to get the deals done are typically available for cybersecurity. And Toby, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head of, if you're buy side, figure it out earlier, because that's going to give you a greater range of tool optionality. And if you're sell side, if you don't know where you are, that's how the meteors hit the earth, right? It isn't really a black swan. It's a white swan that's dirty with oil, right? Which is to say, the sell side companies, James Comey did a 60 Minutes interview where he repeated this trope that we've all heard many times. And it was, there are only two kinds of companies that have been breached: those that have and those that don't know about it. So I think it's a great question, but I think there are a couple of different buckets that are relevant that tie into, what happens in the marketplace. But to be clear, I have seen deals stop for diligence in these issues, and I've seen them in the $30 million range all the way up to $600 million.
Great. Thanks, Toby and Gary, for being here. I have a question regarding cyber insurance coverage. When 4 or 5 years ago, cybersecurity was more of, oh, that's interesting, right? But now for a lot of our portfolio companies, that's definitely a requirement and a mandate, whether it would be data or even traditional manufacturing that has some sort of capability that's online. My question is, moving forward in the next 3 to 5 years horizon, how do you see cyber coverage being evolved in terms of change in cost, in terms of different types of coverage? Right now, I don't think that there's a differentiation on man-in-the-middle attack or denial of service attack. How granular do you think that's going to get into? And is that going to be something that's more of part of the due diligence sort of standard de facto? This is what you need. And also, how does the company have the capability to even know what kind of insurance package to get? Do they even know, right? Because you were saying there's two types of companies: the companies that are attacked or the companies that don't know, right?
So Ben, it's a great question. Toby, if you're okay, I'll take it.
Please.
So a bunch of different things going on there. Generally, I think companies aren't very good at buying insurance, period. I don't think it's a particularly exciting thing to do. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement on the company side to not only understand what coverage they have, what is the coverage we have, but what is the coverage we need. And in cybersecurity, I'm increasingly seeing CISOs and others brought in, especially the best CISOs, where they say, yes, we have coverage. No, it doesn't apply to any of our risk. And there's a gap, there's a dramatic gap between what the coverage looks like and what the enterprise's risk looks like. The second thing that I'm seeing happen, and we have a very large insurance recovery practice at Reed Smiths, I think most people would say the insurance markets are working pretty well when it comes to cyber related issues. And when I say working pretty well, I mean, in general, the carriers have paid many/most of the claims. In other words, it hasn't been a giant boon for our insurance recovery practice. All of our lawyers didn't shift to working on this at our firm, and we have one of the biggest practices. But one of the things that's very interesting there, Ben, and into your question, which is a lot of times the coverage that you have is not the cyber policy. So one of the things we've really seen emerge is whether it's E&O or D&O or crime, other kinds of policies are increasingly being relied on where there is a cyber angle. So it might be that you have $1 million, retention, right? You're going to spend a whole lot of money out of pocket before you hit $1 of a cyber policy. I mean, frankly, I often see where the cyber policy a company has is not the best place to go to look for coverage. It's somewhere else. But then they have something somewhere else and it's $50,000 out of pocket. And then they're into, the layers of coverage. So a couple of moving pieces there. But I think the markets are functioning pretty well. I think companies can get way sharper and better on figuring out what they need. And I think that the insurance side is working pretty well to innovate and build and develop new products. One of the things I think that's been most difficult is to figure out sort of how to price those things. But I haven't been in a bar with a bunch of insurers where they're complaining that they're just making that coverage available way too cheap. So I think it's working for them.
Great, thank you.
Yvonne, I know we're at time here, so.
Yes. So thank you to everyone. Thanks for the questions. Toby, Gary, it was a pleasure having you on here today. Lots of very informative and interesting information. Thank you. Thanks again to RSM and Reed Smith for organizing the event and being fabulous sponsors of our organization. And I hope to see all of you again very soon, hopefully in person next year, and enjoy the rest of your day. The video will be sent around later on, and have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.